Now, welcome to part 2 of our discussion of psychological disorder, Lecture 8d. In this lecture, we're going to talk about personality disorders, a whole other category of disorders, drug addiction, dissociative identity disorder, and schizophrenia. So let's start with personality disorders. A person has a personality disorder when they have some stable and permanent traits, stable ways in which they think or how they engage in their behaviors that negatively affect functioning in life, in relationships, in the workplace, or the well-being of people that you come into contact with. So one example of a personality disorder is called narcissistic personality disorder. And the person that has this disorder thinks they're the greatest being alive, and everything that happens in life is really irrelevant unless it bears on them directly. So they can't imagine anybody or anything mattering more than them. And people with this personality disorder find it essential that they're the center of attention at all times, and people must always do things for them, but they don't expect to be required to be as generous with other people. So these are people that are quite frustrating for others to be around. And just this permanent, stable trait of really selfishness and over self-confidence in considering themselves as just better generally than everyone else, it really impairs these people in their ability to function effectively in life. And it really damages other people as well.
So borderline personality disorder is for those people who are really emotionally volatile and they fear abandonment. So if you're in a relationship with someone with borderline, they might say, I am so in love with you, you are my world, and then 2 weeks later say, I hate you, you disgust me. I'm going to start with this one. So borderline personality disorder is another disorder in which the people are emotionally volatile and they act as though they're completely controlled by moment-to-moment changes in their environment. So if you're in a relationship with them, they might say, I'm so in love with you, you're my world, and then 2 weeks later, I hate you, you disgust me. So they swing from these extremes. They also tend to have a complete lack of self-control. So these people tend to be drug abusers and risk takers. They're terrible with money and credit and wildly emotional.
It's like these people can't conceive of anything in the future or in the past. So every attitude they have about anything is based on what just occurred. So if you're in a fight with one of these people, then you're the most horrible person that exists. If you have a good time with this type of person, then they think you're the most wonderful people ever. And this can all occur in the matter of an hour or less. So this is a very troubling kind of a person to interact with, and it does cause people around them problems, and it causes themselves a lot of problems, folks with this disorder. Now another type of personality disorder, it's quite a famous one, it's called antisocial personality disorder, and the serial killers that you hear about on the news, the people that do just outrageous crimes, that they're often diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. The main feature is a complete lack of a conscience or remorse for wrongdoing. People like this have no empathy. They can hurt other people and they don't really feel bad about it. They don't really take the other person's perspective and how horrible the things they're doing might be experienced by other people, and they just don't feel any guilt for causing damage to others or to property. So other words that have been assigned to these types of people, other labels, morally insane. They've been described as psychopaths or sociopaths. And you can see this in about 30% of males in our population and about 1% of females. And it's estimated as causing over 50% of all serious crimes in the US are committed by people with this mental disorder.
Well, in order to be diagnosed as an antisocial personality disorder, you have to have three of these seven symptoms since childhood. So you need to repeatedly break the law, chronic lying and duping of others, fail to appreciate the consequences of your actions, be repeatedly involved in physical violence, have a complete disregard for safety for yourself and for other people, a consistent failure to meet obligations, and lack of empathy and no remorse for causing harm to others.
What you'll notice is that a person can get this diagnosis even if they haven't been particularly violent, because you only need three of these seven symptoms. And so as a result, there's a number of people that have antisocial personality disorder in business. They just completely unscrupulous in business and will make people destitute and take all their money on false pretenses, but won't feel that guilty about it. Think about some of the brokers on Wall Street, for example. Some of them might be so greedy and they might disregard other people's financial circumstances and best interests so much that they would definitely qualify as having antisocial personality disorder in some cases. So that's the point that appears here. Violent behavior is not always characteristic of this disorder. Really, it's remorseless lying, cheating, or stealing that causes emotional or financial harm to others. So causing harm and not feeling bad about it. And the worst part of it is, although these people are very bad, it's not related at all to intelligence. So a person can be highly intelligent, and this is a pretty potent combination when you combine intelligence with antisocial personality disorder, because now they don't care what happens to other people, and they're clever enough to get away with a lot of criminal activity. And this is the situation that the criminal justice system finds itself in when it's trying to deal with serial killers. The serial killers that take a long time to get caught, the only reason for that is because they're very clever.
Well, and they're also quite charming and likable, as Jason mentioned. So it's hard to believe that someone who seems so charming and friendly could actually be a monster and a serial killer.
There's been instances of people with the disorder staying in, for example, halfway houses, and the women counselors being told how threatening the person is, that they might have to counsel as part of their reintroduction into the society if they've just come out of prison. And I know at least one story that I heard of a psychopath and running away with his counselor. So charming he was that she just couldn't resist, and she partnered up with him, and they both run away and escape the halfway house together. So what you should consider is that though these people can be very likable and charming, this is a facade that they put on in order to manipulate others and gain control of other people's behavior.
So you can see a video of a famous case of a serial killer who did have antisocial personality disorder, and this is Ted Bundy. If you go to link number 11 in the Unit 8 links folder. Well, what would cause antisocial personality disorder? I mean, this is something you want to identify. Remember, they make up a small portion of the population, but they commit 50% of the violent crimes, of the serious crimes. So you want to be able to identify the cause so that maybe you can help prevent this disorder from developing. Well, it seems that there may be a biological cause. So the nervous system of people with antisocial personality disorder doesn't seem to produce the same arousal response in anticipation of punishment as it does with normal people. So think about it. If you're about to engage in an illegal activity, you might get that really anxious feeling. You get an arousal. So that in itself can serve as a deterrent from actually committing the crime, okay? Because you get this intense arousal in response of punishment in case you get caught. Well, people with antisocial personality disorder don't experience that arousal response. So the threat of punishment does not motivate these people not to do something.
It also might be the case that the research suggests that APD people may be genetically predisposed to have a trouble controlling their impulses, and that might be because of a dysfunctional prefrontal cortex. So that's the front part of your brain that controls and inhibits inappropriate behaviors, antisocial behaviors, stealing, violence. If you might want that cookie and not have enough money to pay for it, and you might have momentarily the urge to steal it. Well, that prefrontal cortex part of your brain is suppressing that urge. It's suppressing that urge whenever you want to hit somebody and you don't. And the idea is that the prefrontal cortex is dysfunctional in people with APD, and the result is that they can't control these impulses, these really antisocial impulses that the rest of us are able to. Murderers with APD, for example, they're known to have less of an active prefrontal cortex. So the result is they have less inhibition of these negative behaviors.
And these violent criminals with antisocial personality disorder are more likely to have been severely physically abused as children. So there seems to be a possible link between antisocial personality disorder, severe physical abuse during childhood, and damage to the prefrontal cortex.
So then it's a mixture of influences that would determine whether someone develops the antisocial personality disorder, according to that same vulnerability stress model that we talked about with respect to depression. The idea is that the person's biology predisposes them to the disorder, but the specific experiences they have combine with that predisposition to determine whether the APD manifests itself or doesn't. So you've got a predisposition combined with severe childhood abuse, which would result in a person eventually not really responding to punishment because they've experienced so much of it in their life, and then combine all of that and the outcome could be APD. So following, just as an example of how that predisposition plus experience can give rise to this disorder, if you follow male infants to age 18, you find that the highest proportion in the study that was conducted on these male infants, you find the highest proportion who became violent offenders had both damage to the prefrontal cortex in either maternal neglect or abandonment. So just indicates that the strong influence of experience that might be combined with other predispositions that are determined by just the structure of an APD person's brain.
Okay, well, now we're going to talk about substance abuse. And this is the chronic drug use that's in large quantities, that's a risk to a person's health and then impairs their level of functioning. Okay, so it's a risk to their health and it impairs their functioning. So why would anyone use drugs to the extent that they would cause themselves such harm?
Well, there's some biological theories of addiction that assume that the addiction to drugs is caused by some genetic predisposition. A person has the genetic makeup so that they can't control themselves in consuming something like alcohol or cocaine. So something about the person's brain chemistry, their body makeup, etc., could cause people to develop drug addictions just because of the way their brain is wired up.
Well, the problem is any evidence for the genetic cause of addiction to substances like alcohol is quite weak. So the strongest genetic influence on alcoholism is through relationships to other aspects of someone's personality, like their impulse control or antisocial behavior.
And you'll find, for example, people with APD are also highly likely to have various drug addictions as well. So that's a stronger predictor of drug addiction than any direct link between a person's genetics and alcoholism or other forms of drug addiction. So that's the bottom line, is that genetics might contribute to make people susceptible to drug addiction because the effects of drugs do differ for different people. It's not that they don't have any influence. These other personality factors seem to carry more weight in terms of alcohol and drug addiction. However, a person's reaction to the drug that they ingest determines their susceptibility to become addicted to it. So for example, how much alcohol gets required for a person to experience any effect depends on the concentration of the neurotransmitter dopamine in a person's brain. So determines how long it takes to feel the effects of alcohol. And it's the levels of that transmitter, dopamine, that determine a person's risk for developing alcoholism.
So, in one study, they followed 450 young men. Now, half of these men had fathers who were alcoholics, the other half had fathers that weren't alcoholics. And then those at age 20 who needed more alcohol to feel any reaction were at an increased risk of developing alcoholism, regardless of their family history. So, again, it's this effect of the drug differing for different people that can contribute to the development of alcoholism.
Right, so you're at highest risk for developing alcoholism if it takes you a while to get feeling really drunk. This sort of sets you on a path for requiring an ever more increasing amounts of alcohol to feel its effects, and then you're just consuming much too much alcohol than is at all healthy. So the one of the major biological theories of substance abuse and addiction is sort of referred to as the tissue need theory. So the idea that heavy drug use might itself actually cause drug addiction, right? So forget about the genetic influences that would lead people who take a drug like alcohol or cocaine to develop drug addiction. Actual use of the drug might actually cause the drug addiction itself. This places all the blame in the drug's hands, right? In the chemicals' hands. So, for example, a heavy drinker might actually alter their brain structure and chemistry, and that might then require them to have an ever increasing amount of alcohol and an ever increasing need to consume alcohol just to feel normal. Forget about feeling drunk. A person might actually have to keep taking it just to feel normal. And if they don't take it, they'll feel way worse than normal. So this is a tissue need theory. Your brain comes to need the drug, and now to function properly at all, it requires some amount of the drug in the system.
Well, the problem with the tissue need theory is that biology is the only cause of addiction. It doesn't look at other factors. While heavy use of drugs, such as heroin, can be abandoned without any withdrawal, which you wouldn't predict based on this tissue need theory. In fact, during the Vietnam War, 30% of US soldiers were using heroin. And yet, when they left Vietnam and went back home, they stopped using heroin and they didn't suffer any withdrawal symptoms. So it can't just be biology that's driving the addiction. As well, people can go through these withdrawal symptoms and be finished with that biological craving, but still be addicted to the drug. Think about it. If this wasn't the case, you wouldn't have people who repeatedly try to get off a drug. So an alcoholic who will go 100 days without a drink. Well, during that time, they've already gotten over the physical cravings, the physical symptoms of withdrawal, and yet they might still have a drink, okay? Or someone who smokes. Once they stop, it only takes a few days for the physical symptoms to be done, and yet people will still start smoking again, even after they've tried to quit.
Well, it turns out also that, well, if you adopt a tissue need theory, then it wouldn't matter where on the planet a person's consuming alcohol. Exposure to alcohol will necessarily cause high rates of alcoholism because it's the mere exposure to alcohol that causes the brain to need it so much, driving people to keep right on drinking just to feel normal. Same would be true of cocaine addiction or heroin addiction. So that's not consistent, though, with all the evidence that culture determines quite strongly whether rates of alcoholism are high within that culture or low. And you find that rates of alcohol abuse are quite a bit higher when, for example, a culture forbids alcohol consumption in children or adolescents, but endorses drunkenness in adults. So it's not that it's not a good idea to discourage children and adolescents from drinking. It's just the contrast that sets up. Everything's great. It's all great for adults to drink and look at the super lifestyle that goes along with it. Children and adolescents, zero tolerance for consumption of alcohol. Zero tolerance for even being able to enter places, often places where drinking is occurring. And this contrast actually enhances the levels of alcoholism within a country. and a culture, because once the children become the adult age where they're now all of a sudden permitted to drink as much as they want, then it's a binge situation. So if it's um, there's nothing people like to do more than something they've been deprived of for a long period of their life. However, alcohol abuse rates are much lower when children are actually gradually introduced to the concept of drinking in a family setting, and drunkenness, complete drunkenness, is completely frowned upon.
This is in places like Italy, Greece, and France. So moderate drinking, responsible drinking within a family setting instead of drunken behavior out in a bar or in the streets. So again, lower rates when it's set within a family.
Right. Our culture, Western culture, glamorizes complete drunkenness. Just look at any documentary or movie about spring break in Florida. And there's a lot of context in which complete drunkenness is glorified in the media in our culture. But in these other European cultures, a person's first encounters with alcohol would be at family dinners drinking wine. In this case, alcohol is just a part of life, and people know the dangers, but there's not a zero tolerance attitude towards it as far as children are concerned, where it's no alcohol, then all of a sudden all the alcohol you could ever want. Just that contrast causes a lot of alcoholism.
Well, rates of drug abuse are also higher if society enforces a complete abstinence from drug use. So think about the prohibition in the 1920s. It didn't stop people from drinking, but it does prevent people from learning how to drink moderately and responsibly. Okay, so, and this is important. You need the opportunity to learn how to drink moderately and responsibly. Otherwise, these drug abuse rates are going to be higher.
Right, when you're deprived of it, again, and in this case, in the 1920s, you didn't know when you would get another opportunity to drink again. So people just went for it, right? When they had the chance. So it didn't eliminate the use of alcohol. It just put it underground. And that's true of illegal drugs in our present modern world. Well, so that kind of leads us to think there might be a non-biological cause of addiction, that is, a non-genetic influence, a non-tissue need influence on the cause of drug addiction. So merely taking drugs such as heroin or alcohol, it doesn't necessarily cause addiction, and the true facts of that matter are, and we sort of mentioned this before, that by far the greatest majority of people that take any drug don't become addicted to it. So it's just simply not the case that there's drugs out there that if you take them once or twice, you'll be hooked for life. There's just plenty of people that have taken each drug you can think of: crystal meth, heroin, cocaine, once, twice, wasn't for them, didn't do it anymore. So it's not that the drugs are not as powerful as they're made out to be. On their own, they require people in certain situations for addictions to occur. So drug use is most likely to cause addiction when it's used to suppress anxiety or fear. When it's used as a coping mechanism, you can expect people to do more of it. If it's used to ward off depression, then if it's a tool to ward off depression, people are going to do it fairly continuously. And if the drug use is caused by future concerns or in order to forget about past painful life events, these are the kinds of factors in a person's environment, in the situation that they're in life, that promote drug addiction. And it's not as simple as saying there's drugs out there that are highly addictive, and if you come into contact with them at all, you're going to be a drug addict. If you want people not to get addicted to drugs, here's where you should look. These kind of psychological factors that are based on their life situation.
Now we're going to talk about behavior without awareness, or a dissociation or separation between your behavior and conscious awareness. And this is relatively common. You must have had at least one experience where you were driving somewhere and you were just driving on autopilot. And the next thing you know, you're at your destination already, even though you don't remember driving there. Okay, this would be an automatic behavior or skill. And many skills are automatic and can occur without the need for conscious control. So when you're typing, imagine you're not thinking about how to position your fingers on the keyboard and how to move them. Or when you're texting, something I still can't do, but I see people texting so quickly, and they've developed it from a controlled process to this automatic process where they don't even have to think about it. It's so fast. Reading is also an automatic process. I don't want you to read this word.
So it's impossible. You can't avoid it. You're going to read it anyways. So these are processes that you can't control. And that's something that's true of everybody. Everybody has these skills that are so well practiced that they become unconscious. You can run them off without even consciously thinking about them. But there's some more extreme cases in which big chunks of a person's entire life might actually become unconscious to them. And that's another form of disorder that you'll find in that DSM-4 called dissociative identity disorder. Another term for this is multiple personality disorder. Very controversial disorder. There's some question as to whether it exists at all, but let me just describe what it is for you. It's much more dramatic than just having these automatic behaviors that can run off unconsciously. This is a case where a person's personality, their behavior, their conscious awareness of long periods of time, their memory for events, etc., gets split based on the adoption of separate identities. And some people diagnosed with this disorder have reported more than 100 personalities, unique personalities living within them. A 100-person for the price of one.
What a deal. Well, the existence of dissociative identity disorder is a very bitter controversy because in one corner you have psychologists who believe that multiple personality disorder is more common than people think, and it's a reaction to childhood trauma. So what happens is if a child goes through sexual or physical abuse, different personalities are going to get created to be cut off from the person's awareness, and these new personalities are going to deal with the abuse. Okay, so yeah, the idea is that there's trauma, that trauma leads to a new personality being developed to deal with it. So if you want to see a case of multiple personality disorder, a movie about a case, you should look at Sybil.
And there's The Three Faces of Eve is an old example. There's been a number of Hollywood movies that have demonstrated this disorder.
And often these personalities are discovered through hypnosis.
So the idea is that you've had these awful things happen to you in childhood and you create different personalities to deal with them. Just like Freud's repression idea, except a bit more exotic than that. Instead of just cramming these painful memories into your unconscious, you actually break yourself into littler bits and assign the task of some of these other personalities to deal with those painful experiences, while the main part of you is happily unaware of them. Well, people that believe that multiple personality disorder does exist and it is common, it's a normal reaction to childhood traumatic events, they will go looking for personalities in the clients that come to see them, and they'll try to find them through the process of hypnosis. So they'll hypnotize the person and they'll hunt for alternate personalities in them. If they show some sort of symptom that they think is related to this disorder and a likely signature of this disorder, like the person is just feeling depressed a lot of the time, they're not getting along with their relations, their spouse or their children or their friends. You know, it's problems that almost anybody would face, and the therapists that were, let's just say, superb at discovering instances of multiple personality disorder would interpret these rather normal challenges of life that a client might come talk to them about as evidence for there's probably other personalities in there buried, and we just gotta dig them out and make you aware of them through hypnosis. Once you're aware of them, then you can deal with these painful experiences that these other personalities are aware of, and then reintegrate the goal of this kind of therapy is to bring out as many of the personalities as you can, find them, hunt them down, bring them into consciousness so that they're all aware of one another, and then tie the person all back together and unify all these personalities. In the other corner, there's psychologists who disagree vehemently that multiple personality disorder even exists because they're worried that through hypnosis, finding different personalities isn't finding them, it's creating them. That through the process of hypnosis, which we know makes a person very suggestive, that a person might actually imagine themselves to have a number of different other personalities and behave accordingly. Hypnosis is very effective at causing a person to deviate from reality, giving them memories for events that didn't really happen to them, and in this case, giving them the sense that they have these different personalities. Okay, it's interesting to note that before 1980, multiple personality disorder was very, very rare, hardly ever observed by therapists. Since its addition of the disorder to the DSM, many thousands of cases have been diagnosed. So here, potentially, could be a case of overdiagnosis. Even worse, possible that the psychologists are actually creating instances of this disorder through the therapy sessions that they conduct.
Well, and the techniques that are used to uncover these personalities often involve many, many hours of intense social pressure by a therapist who's an authority figure to force these alternate personalities to come forward. So, one therapist bragged that he would just keep pressuring his patients for hours and hours and not let them have a break and just keep going until they finally came forward with a personality. Okay, so this seems somewhat reminiscent of Milgram's shock experiment. When you have someone in authority telling you to do something, you tend to go along with it. You have a therapist who you believe is there trying to help you and is knowledgeable, saying that you have a multiple personality disorder. You need to tell me about your disorders. And you don't get to end your session until you uncover these personalities. So intense social pressure.
Yeah, and look, client, there's only one way we're going to fix you, and that's if we start finding these personalities, right? So, but from the therapist's perspective, they weren't probably consciously aware of the pressure techniques they were employing. Their attitude is that these personalities are not going to come forward easily. They're there to protect the person, so they're going to resist any effort to bring them into awareness of the person and expose themselves to the therapist. So you really got to be aggressive. But of course, these pressure techniques generate alternate personalities, particularly if they're combined with this idea that there's only one way we're fixing you, and that's if you start generating these alternate personalities that we know are in you. Awkward situation. There was a psychiatrist in Parry Sound, Ontario, that diagnosed dozens of people with multiple personality disorder. So this one pretty little town in Ontario was just riddled with MPD people, and that sort of raised suspicions that how did they all pop up in this one little town? And it turned out that these people really didn't have any multiple personality disorder before they entered into the therapy, but ended up with the disorder while they were walking out, suggesting that it had more to do with this therapist's behavior than the actual disorder or the actual psychological problems of the patients. So this leads us to a different way of thinking about multiple personality disorder, that it's not really a disorder that exists, it's a disorder that psychologists created because of the cool media implications of it. Everybody's very entertained by the idea of folks having more than one personality in them, and the search for these examples of this in their clinical practices.
Well, it also was quite a financial boon to these therapists because it would take years and years of intensive therapy, all of which was covered by the healthcare system because it was a disorder listed in the DSM.
Mm-hmm. And so it became a social situation, the therapist-client relationship, in which a person was expected to have alternate personalities, and the client generated them. The explanation is that the client feels pressure to generate these personalities because of the therapist's expectations and pressure.
Okay, so imagine that you're in psychological distress. You're upset and you want to know why. Why are you depressed? Why are you anxious? You just want to find the cause. So you go to a therapist, someone that you think is knowledgeable. Now, he tells you you're probably in distress because you were severely abused as a child and don't remember. Well, what can you say to this? He's telling you that you were abused, and he's an expert. You have all the symptoms of someone who's been abused, but you also don't remember it.
And if you say you don't remember, that's just another piece of evidence that he's right, because that's an example of denial and just how deeply these memories have been repressed in you.
Yeah, so there's no way of denying this experience as far as the therapist is concerned. Then he also tells you you have alternate personalities that are protecting you from your memory of these events. So you were abused and you couldn't handle it, and you created these alternate personalities. Well, now imagine the therapist does the following. Under hypnosis, he or she asks you to think about your experiences of abuse during childhood. Now remember, you don't remember being abused. So they would give ideas like you should go home and look at photos, family photos of when you were younger, and see if anyone in those photos could have possibly abused you. You need to go home and imagine what it would have been like to be abused. So now you're put under hypnosis and asked to think about these experiences of abuse. And then they keep applying pressure for these alternate personalities to reveal themselves. And again, it's not a friendly chat, it's intense hours of pressure. And the only way to get better is to create these alternate personalities.
It's literally shouting at you in some cases to force you to give up these alternate personalities that are hidden deep down. So these aspects of the therapeutic setting we know are formula for creating MPD people because people are motivated to get some explanation for their distress. That's why they came to therapy in the first place. They want to know what's wrong. And hypnosis is an excellent way to get people to remember experiences that never happened. That is, they'll generate and imagine events quite vividly, and then that gets into memory too. And now you can't tell the difference between that vivid thing you imagined and a real event. So you think it happened to you. It also, and then the final piece of the recipe is trust in the expertise of the therapist, which leads people to behave in ways that are consistent with what the therapist expects. You want to be a good client. You want to show that you're taking the advice of the therapist and working hard and trying to get better. Well, in this case, the only option for you is to generate these alternate personalities. He's not letting you go otherwise. And so then all the evidence that the therapist needs to show that multiple personality disorder is real and prevalent gets generated just through how they behave with the clients that they see. So the reason why we're mentioning this as an example is because not all the disorders that people get labeled with are necessarily arise from them and the problems they face in life. Some of them actually arise from the minds of the psychologists. Bad thing for a field to be doing, creating disorders that it's meant to treat, but it does happen because of confusion and ignorance of some clinical psychologists. So once people start behaving as though they have these multiple personalities, now it's quite easy for them to be maintained and for a person to believe they have the disorder because they get, through all these multiple sessions, they get pretty skilled at flipping from one personality to the next.
Well, schizophrenia, unlike dissociative identity disorder, does not involve a split into separate personalities. Instead, words are split from meaning and actions are split from motives. So a major component of schizophrenia is psychosis. And this is a problem involving distorted perceptions of reality. and this can have devastating consequences for someone's ability to function.
So schizophrenia can be divided up into positive and negative symptoms, and a person might more or less mainly have positive symptoms or might mainly have negative symptoms, and other people with schizophrenia might flip back and forth between the positive and negative symptoms alternately. So the positive symptoms can include bizarre delusions. A person might think they're the prime minister and be convinced of it. People might be convinced they're Jesus, or that they're the reincarnation of Genghis Khan, or just very bizarre delusions about who they are. And they might have some delusions about the government's interest in them and the fact that they might be monitored by a tracking device, or there might be an alien mothership that's controlling their thoughts and reading their minds. That kind of bizarre delusion is pretty characteristic of schizophrenia, and you can tell that there's a paranoid theme to these kinds of delusions, if it's not about delusions of grandeur and thinking that they are, for example, superheroes might be a thing that somebody would have a delusion about, thinking that they're a superhero. Another positive symptom category are hallucinations and distorted sensations. So this is talking nonsense to one another, hearing voices talk to one another, either nonsense or telling the person to perform actions, even violent actions that they don't want to perform. A person might have vividly powerful visual hallucinations, so actually witness events that aren't really occurring in the present, but they can be convinced that it's actually happening. See spiders all over the wall or something like that, and be convinced that it's real, or leprechauns, or a car smoking a parking meter. Bizarre, weird hallucinations that seem very real to the person that has them.
Another positive symptom is disorganized, incoherent speech. So here would be an example. Sandwich mustard is good, but I like television for its efficiency in solving crossword puzzles. So remember how I mentioned that sometimes the words get split from the meaning? Well, this is what is meant by this disorganized, incoherent speech. So they'll speak sentences with very remote associations between the concepts, and we call this word salads.
Also, lots of disorganized and inappropriate behavior. So you can encounter somebody that's uh, suffering from a positive symptoms of schizophrenia. They can end up being really silly, childish, hostile, or violent, very unpredictable, completely inappropriate, can end up urinating in the most inappropriate places in public, flashing and stuff, not wearing proper clothes for the conditions. So behaviors are just out of whack with what a person normally would do. So these can be most obvious in terms of the people with schizophrenia that one might encounter in everyday life. It's most obvious because of a often complete disregard for social norms as far as clothing, hygiene goes, and also bizarre actions. So weird kinds of encounters with people maybe on the bus that are talking even though no one's listening to them and they're not making much sense. More than likely these are people with expressing positive symptoms of schizophrenia.
Now, negative symptoms are those symptoms that involve a loss of normal abilities. So one of them would be loss of motivation. So they might slip into a catatonic stupor. So this is when there's a complete withdrawal for days without any movement. Okay, just completely withdrawn from any interaction with the outside world.
The person will starve to death. If they're not cared for, a person that has this negative symptom of schizophrenia will literally sit there and starve to death without getting any motivation to do anything to get food or.
And they also have a poverty of speech. So very few verbal responses in conversations because they have this diminished cognitive ability. So speaking fluently is impaired.
Or speaking at all, in fact. One word responses are a lot for somebody in one of these schizophrenic episodes if the negative symptoms are predominant. You also get emotional flatness, so there's complete lack of facial expression of emotion. monotone tone of voice. And so that's the final negative symptom we'll talk about. As I mentioned, these symptoms aren't simultaneous negative and positive ones. Often they're sort of contradictory. You can't really have a lack of motivation and also a bunch of disorganized, frightening behavior, surprising behavior. So these are not simultaneous, but they vary in a person to what extent either positive or negative symptoms are dominant, and this fluctuates across time even in the same person in some cases. The onset of schizophrenia is usually late adolescence or early adulthood. So folks that develop schizophrenia typically develop it right around the time that they start university.
So for a video of a case of schizophrenia, you should see link number 12 in the Unit 8 links folder. Well, what are the causes of schizophrenia? Well, it seems that genetic factors likely play an important role in the development of this disorder.
So if you look at, these are all the genetic relationships that they've done studies with pairs of people. So you consider identical twins, 100% overlap in their DNA, the offspring of two schizophrenic parents, so just regular siblings, they share only 50% of their DNA. This is a fraternal twins, 50%, offspring of only one schizophrenic patient. So that's a child of a schizophrenic person where one of the parents are schizophrenic and the other is not. And this is the genetic relatedness of two siblings. If it's just a nephew or a niece, 25%, and then completely no relationship as far as DNA goes for unrelated people in the general population. This is the percentage of concordance for identical twins. If one identical twin develops schizophrenia, there's about a 50% chance that the other one will. This drops a bit if it's both schizophrenic parents. So both schizophrenic, both patient, it's both parent. Boy, it's hard to distinguish patients from
It's about
parents.
Between 35 and 46% if both parents have the disorder, and only 12% if only one parent has schizophrenia.
Well, that says 45%, but you get the picture. To the extent that your parents have schizophrenia or that one of your siblings does, you're more likely to get it, which suggests there's this genetic influence in developing schizophrenia. Now, other than genes, it seems like before birth and during birth brain damage has a big role to play in terms of whether someone gets schizophrenia. This can be the result of malnutrition, a viral infection during pregnancy, birth complications that damage the brain or deprive the infant of oxygen. So all of these things at this very vulnerable stage have big impact on ultimate brain development and how well the brain develops throughout childhood and into adulthood. So schizophrenia seems to arise from brain damage that occurs at this very important early stage. So part of this, people have suggested, is that it's really the dopamine systems in the brain, the ones that rely on the neurotransmitter dopamine, that are most affected by these before birth and just after birth brain injuries, sources of damage to the brain, disrupts these dopamine mechanisms in the brain.
However, it's important to note that similar neurotransmitter abnormalities are found in other disorders like depression. So it can't just be the neurotransmitters.
So, but these are some pieces of evidence that suggest dopamine systems are heavily involved in schizophrenia. That is, drugs that increase dopamine release can create or worsen the symptoms of schizophrenia. So scientists originally attributed overactivity at dopamine synapses to excessive synthesis and release of dopamine, but it seems like it's actually the concentration of dopamine within the synapses that is related to schizophrenia. They seem to have more dopamine floating around in their receptors. Also, people with schizophrenia seem to have more overactivity at the dopamine synapses, causing the brain circuits that rely on dopamine to be more sensitive to its presence. So there's more of it, and the neurons are more sensitive to its presence. And then antipsychotic drugs are effective in treating schizophrenia, seem to be most effective because they bind to dopamine receptor sites and block normal dopamine activity. So all of this evidence combined suggests that it's too much dopamine and an oversensitivity to the dopamine neurotransmitter that causes these positive and negative symptoms of schizophrenia, and that the problems with these dopamine circuits might stem from these early brain injuries in infancy and prior to birth. Other people have suggested that the main brain abnormality that causes schizophrenia are enlarged ventricles. Now, we all have in our brains these ventricles, which are just cavities that are filled with fluid, cerebral spinal fluid, all the way down your spinal cord. Up here is one of the ventricles, and then all of these liquid-filled cavities in the middle of your brain here seem to be enlarged in people with schizophrenia, so that this pressure that's being generated by larger than normal ventricles is messing up with the mechanisms in the brain and might have a role to play in these positive and negative symptoms of schizophrenia.
So here's a neurodevelopmental hypothesis about how schizophrenia might develop. So you have prenatal viral infection, prenatal malnutrition, complications during delivery, and other brain injuries. This all leads into a disruption of normal maturational processes before or at birth. So you have prenatal risks and birth complications contributing. This can lead to subtle neurological damage, which might lead to minor physical anomalies, but it also leads to an increased vulnerability to schizophrenia.
And they mention the graph mentions these minor physical anomalies because along with the brain damage that is associated with people's schizophrenia, there's also some distinctive features, physical features that can be observed in people with schizophrenia, making them appear a bit different from the average person.
Well, and it has been suggested because it develops in adolescence. So why would it start in adolescence? Well, adolescence is an important time for pruning away of those connections in the brain that aren't necessary anymore. And it seems that people with schizophrenia may prune too much of these neurons. So it might be over pruning.
So you notice how this combines a lot of the things we've been talking about, the pre and after birth complications associated with these things, causing some brain damage, which might involve disruptions in the dopamine system and enlarged ventricles, ultimately resulting in vulnerability to schizophrenia. So nothing's ever as simple as it's a gene that causes it or it's a brain damage that causes it. Nothing seems to be that simple when it comes to psychology. So many people have been forced to come up with what's called a stress vulnerability hypothesis for schizophrenia. It's kind of like that vulnerability stress model of depression we talked about, and the one we talked about for, I think it was, well, one of the other disorders. And the idea is that it's a combination of both these biological predisposing factors and also environmental influences that actually give rise to a person's schizophrenia. So you can think about a lot of things that might cause stress in a person's environment. They're not doing well in school, they have work trouble, they're being rejected socially, they've got a lot of conflicts at home, not a lot of social support, they don't have many friends, and that's right now. And then in their past, there could be a list of these factors in a person's life history, like they haven't been very good at communicating with others, they haven't expressed their emotions very well, so they haven't been able to make many friends, they don't have many positive family relationships, and they're not really good socially, and they don't have great coping skills. Combine these two, and now that's stressful. That's going to generate a lot of stress for a person. And then combine that with biological factors. You got the genetic predisposition for schizophrenia, a disruption of their neurological development, problems in a person's neurochemistry, the dopamine system, for example, maybe some abnormalities in the brain like the enlarged ventricles, and now you have a vulnerability to get schizophrenia. Now, if you combine these two things, It's the combination of them both that ultimately determines the emergence of schizophrenia in a person.
Well, here is just a chart describing the portion of the population meeting a criteria for a disorder. So you'll notice schizophrenic disorders are relatively rare. They only occur in about 2% of the population. However, look at how many people are diagnosed with any disorder. 44% of the population have a mental disorder. This is what we mean by overdiagnosing, where everyday activities become mental illness. But that's disturbing on its own. But substance use disorders, so this would be including alcoholism, it's about 24%. Anxiety disorders, it looks like it's around 19%, and mood disorders at 15%. So again, a lot of the population is being diagnosed with a disorder, 44%. So we need to figure out some treatments for these disorders, and that's what we're going to talk about in the next two lectures, psychological treatments.